I'm going to sing for you is called the 1934 Salesville Massacre, and it tells the story of what happened on these lands. But it starts with the Algonquin people, too. There's a refrain for you, and I can't sing it without you. By the brook in the middle of the marshy meadow, by the brook in the middle of the marshy meadow, by the brook in the middle of the marshy meadow, I lay my body down. So I'm going to sing it that for you a couple times. And you are going to pick that up and sing along with me. And I'm going to tell you the story of what happened. Bye. Oh, wow. I hope you all got, you brought your low voices today. By the brook in the middle of the marshy meadow, by the brook in the middle of the marshy meadow, by the brook in the middle of the marshy meadow, I lay my body down. By the brook in the middle of the marshy meadow, by the brook in the middle of the marshy meadow, by the brook in the middle of the marshy meadow, I lay my body down. In 1934, the National Guard was at the mill door. Governor Green sat down and more to lay my body down. By the brook in the middle of the marshy meadow, by the brook in the middle of the marshy meadow, by the brook in the middle of the marshy meadow, I lay my body down. If the deputy sheriff had their way, the workers and the strikers would be forced to stay at the Salesville mill where they worked for pay, then lay their bodies down. By the brook in the middle of the marshy meadow, by the brook in the middle of the marshy meadow, by the brook in the middle of the marshy meadow, I lay my body down. Hero! On a long September day, the strikers ran for cover where their families lay. Beneath the stones that marked the way, they lay their bodies down. By the brook in the middle of the marshy meadow, by the brook in the middle of the marshy meadow, by the brook in the middle of the marshy meadow, I lay my body down. Oh, the marshy meadow is an old land, Moshassuck of the native people who took the stand, then lay their bodies down. By the brook in the middle of the marshy meadow, by the brook in the middle of the marshy meadow, by the brook in the middle of the marshy meadow, I lay my body down. To all who labor and earn their sleep, Moshassuck is on and all too. The strikers shut the mill and the univ before we laid our bodies down. Ready?
Here we go.
By the brook
in the middle of the marshy meadow, by the brook in the middle of the marshy meadow, by the brook in the middle of the marshy meadow, I lay my body down.
one more time.
By the brook in the middle of the marshy meadow, by the brook in the middle of the marshy meadow, by the brook in the middle of the marshy meadow, I lay my body down.
Thank you, Mary Lee. And Mary Lee will be back to close our program today. Let me start by saying I've got a spare umbrella here that at least 2 people can fit under if you want to come and grab it, for those of you who didn't fit under our tent. Good morning, everyone, and happy Labor Day. My name is James Parisi. I'm a field rep with the Rhode Island Federation of Teachers and Health Professionals, and I'm president of the Rhode Island Labor History Society. Thank you. The annual Labor Day address started over a decade ago, and we maintain its tradition because it is just so important for us at the Labor History Society to commemorate labor, community, and labor unions on Labor Day, our holiday. It's important for us to both reflect on the past as well as contemplate a better future for workers and their families. And it's important for us to celebrate Labor Day in a very tangible way. Why are we here? We're here because of the events of 1934, when we had our first Labor Day address to commemorate what happened here when the National Guard opened fire on strikers and community supporters, killing people and leaving a couple of holes in the tombstone over to my right. If you haven't seen it yet, take a look at it on your way out. Several of our talks have centered on the events of 1934, but we've also had other issues that we've raised at our annual Labor Day address. The labor history, what are we about? We're about preserving labor history with issuing a lot of publications. We're about disseminating labor history with programs, book talks, and panel discussions. We're about encouraging labor history with scholarships, particularly for our youth who do labor-oriented projects. And we're about celebrating labor history with our annual awards banquet. Just want to briefly describe what we do as an organization. So we hold an annual awards banquet. We had our 34th banquet a couple of weeks ago. We honored 5 people. We honored Raul Figueroa from Fuerza Laboral on a Lifetime Achievement Award, noting his work with immigrant labor and really strengthening community support of working people issue, including people who are not members of labor unions. We recognize Nancy Idaluca from the Hotel Employees Restaurant Union, Unite Here, on a Lifetime Achievement Award for diligent work representing low-wage workers in a very real and compelling way, particularly recognizing the struggles her members went through during the COVID shutdown when her union experienced a 90% unemployment rate. We recognize Tim Melia from UFCW Local 328 with a Lifetime Achievement Award. Tim's been a longtime labor leader of UFCW, was active and a leader in the recent Stop and Shop strike of a couple of years ago, and has just spent his life dedicated to organizing and representing, and he really highlighted the continued organizing his union does. We recognized with our first Trailblazer Award, Amy Mullen, and I thought I saw Amy here today. Congratulations, Amy, in the back. Amy's a union leader who lost her job advocating for her members, and kudos to her union, NEARI, and her attorney, Liz Weens, for getting her job back after that unjust termination. But it was just such an important story where in the midst of a pandemic, when workers want to have a voice at how to respond to the pandemic, some employers don't want to hear that voice, want to shut down that voice to the degree where they actually fired a union leader for it. So we were really thrilled to have Amy receive our first Trailblazer Award at this past year's banquet. And then finally, we honored with a posthumous award Ray Sullivan. Pat Crowley did a great job introducing, a terrific human being, and it's terrible that we don't have him with us still today. Ray was a former representative who had a great relationship with labor leaders and was a kind of legislator who never forgot his principles but learned firsthand that you got to work with other people to get things done. And then, of course, he went on to be an advocate for unions and other groups as a lobbyist, and most importantly was a leader of the marriage equality campaign, the successful marriage equality campaign. We hosted a spring speaker series on African American labor history. We had 2 different talks from Keith Stokes, who did a great job. On the first talk, he described the matter of truth, that report that the city of Providence developed about the African heritage and indigenous people over a 400-year span. And then his second talk focused on a Rhode Island story. It was about the formation of the American Colored Labor Union by George Downing. He was a Civil War era community leader, born in New York, but came to Rhode Island. This guy actually organized formerly enslaved African Americans right after the Civil War. It was just a really great story with a very real Rhode Island connection. And then finally, we had our own Pat Crowley. Pat's in the back as well. Did a great job reprising his talk on desegregation in the Boilermakers, the story of integration and how community and local unions deal with their national unions when they don't have a similar perspective on things. It was a really fascinating story. It was about the shipyards in Providence during World War II. And what I got out of the talk more than anything is, the local folks who have a sense of justice organizing together, taking on a national union that was not supportive of its own members and was violating civil rights. We annually award cash prizes to students who participate in History Day. History Day is a statewide competition to represent Rhode Island in the National History Competition, where secondary students do history-oriented projects, whether it's a documentary or a PowerPoint or a paper. And we like encouraging labor history projects for History Day. And this year we issued $100 checks to students who did 2 different labor-oriented projects. One was on the Delano grape strike, the farm worker strike, and the boycott that followed. And then the other was actually on the 1934 textile strike. So we just want to encourage students to embrace labor history, look at labor history, learn from labor history, and then disseminate labor history. We do publication mailings. We put out to every member the Rhode Island History Society journal, because it had a couple of articles, including a work by Pat Crowley and a work by another Labor History Society member, Pat Raub, on the history of the Providence libraries. We sponsored the open house at the Museum of Work and Culture. They were open free of charge on Saturday, and we co-sponsored the talk that they had on Latino organizing up at the Museum of Work and Culture in Woonsocket a couple of days ago. What's on tap? Let me just briefly say we're organizing a panel discussion on organizing on the 60s and 70s, probably in November. Our own Mike D'Amico has Mike sitting in the chair over there, who's a logistics guy so important to the Labor History Society, did a graphic booklet on labor in Rhode Island. And we're getting it printed up, and we're going to be mailing it to all of our members. We're also going to do a theater outing in the spring up at the Stadium Theater in Woonsocket. They have a theater series, and one of the plays they're showing is The Newsies. It's a play about newspaper boys, organizing, and we're going to have an outing for that. We're going to also publish a book on the first 50 or so honorees of the Labor History Society. Like I said, we've been holding our banquet for 34 years. There's over 150 community leaders, labor leaders that we've recognized over the years, and we don't want to lose their stories. So we've hired a person who's working on creating one-page biographies of these folks, and we're going to put it into a booklet and mail the first 50 or so out to our members in the fall. And then finally, we're planning a labor tour of Slater Mill. Slater Mill is a great place to visit for a lot of reasons, but having a tour that focuses on the labor side of it. Just want to comment for a minute about why we do it. Why do 15 or so volunteers give up 6 Friday afternoons every year to plan this stuff? First of all, it's great to have people who are willing to do that. It's really important for us to keep labor history alive and prominent in people's minds. Scott Malloy always reminds me that there was a time when every New England state had a labor history society. Rhode Island is the only one left, and we're proud of that. We're very proud of that. We think it's important to, thank you. So why promote and recognize labor history? Well, maybe people alive today might get some inspiration or learn something when they find out that the first women-led strike in the United States was right here in Rhode Island, in Pawtucket in 1824 for the turnout. Maybe people today will learn something or be inspired when they learn about the desegregation fight in the shipyards back in the 40s, or maybe they're going to be inspired and learn something if you're a public employee about teachers willing to go to jail when they went on strike 30 years ago this year in Warwick, or 50 years ago in Pawtucket, when they were advocating for just pay and benefits, and sometimes they were just opposing employers who would fire women, when they got pregnant. That happened before we had unions active. Maybe Rhode Islanders today will learn something and be inspired when they learn about slave labor. And slavery happened here in Rhode Island, but slavery in Rhode Island looked different than plantation slavery in the South, where we had skilled laborers who were enslaved human beings. But it was an interesting story, and we all learn from that. Maybe we're going to learn something about the community support that was part of this story here in 1934, when it was really the community that came together with the striking textile workers and really took a stand. We think the Labor History Society adds value by keeping these stories alive, by promoting these stories, and by making sure that the next generation, remembers something of past generations. So, as I said, we're about a 17-member volunteer board. Some of the folks on our labor history board are union staff, like I am. Some are in academia, like Miriam, who's going to introduce our speaker in a moment. Some of our members are workers, like Ryan, who organized, this event and coordinated with the cemetery staff, who's a classroom teacher. And then we have a bunch of active retirees, like Scott and Jimmy Riley and Mike D'Amico, who really take care of the logistics of this thing. So how do we do it? We do it by the support of 115 lifetime members who gave us $150 to stay on our mailing list in perpetuity. We do it by having over 4 dozen labor unions pay annual dues to us, and that provides significant support. And then we have about 100 folks who pay annual dues. We welcome you to join us if you're not a member. We've got some membership brochures that are only slightly wet under the cover over there. Dues are just, they were $15 and $25 for 1 or 2 year memberships. We raised that to $25 and $40, but we'll cash any check you send our way. I know there's several of our statewide office holders here, and a couple I may have missed, but I'd like to recognize our Attorney General, Peter Nerona, and under the black umbrella in the back. As I was telling Peter, some folks come every year, whether it's an election year or not, and we always welcome his attendance at this important event. Our General Treasurer is here, holding a 1-year-old, Seth Magaziner. Welcome. Someone who understands the importance of education is Representative Greg Amore, who's joined us today. Greg, thank you very much for being here. Someone who smartly sat in the front row to stay dry is our Lieutenant Governor, Sabina Matos. Sabina, welcome. I saw in the crowd a couple of representatives and local elected officials. Jim Diosa, who is a former mayor of the city we're in, is here today. Thank you, Jim, for coming out. One of the late arrivals was Nellie Gorbea, our current Secretary of State. Nellie, thank you for being here today. Welcome to this important event. David Morales, a rep, is in the back. A former senator, Mark McKinney, is in the back. And former Rep Jack Lyle is under an umbrella, safe and dry. And if I missed anyone else, Val Lawson and Senator Cano. Oh, all the way in the back. Senators, thank you very much. Val Lawson, union leader and senator from East Prov, and Senator Cano, who's a terrific head of the Senate Education Committee and senator from Pawtucket. So for purposes of introduction, I'd like to call up to the podium Miriam Ruman. Miriam is a professor at URI, and probably more importantly to me, she's a union leader for the faculty union at AAUP. And I'm particularly happy that AUP over the summer voted to affiliate with the American Federation of Teachers. So locally, the AFT gives an extra special welcome to the college professors at URI.
Thank you, Jim. Hi, I am delighted to introduce Erik Loomis, our speaker for today, who is my colleague at URI. Erik has a PhD from the University of New Mexico, master's from University of Tennessee, and bachelor's from University of Oregon, which makes his presence in New England deeply confusing to everyone, especially him. He is, as Jim mentioned, a professor of history at URI, where he teaches courses in labor and environmental history, among other areas. He also sits on the executive committee of our AAUP full-time faculty union, and I particularly like this, regularly encourages graduate students to join their union to push back against the evil machinations of people like us who would exploit them if we could. And I've taken a cue from that and do the same. Erik blogs regularly at Lawyers, Guns, and Money on labor, environmental issues, sports, graves, anything that kind of catches his fancy. His work has also appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, Dissent, Boston Review, and the New Republic, and he was featured on the most recent public TV documentary on William Randolph Hearst as one of the talking heads who gestured a whole lot. His first book was Out of Sight, which examines how overseas outsourcing brought labor and environmental exploitation overseas with it, as well as harming American workers and regulatory standards. It was followed by Empire of Timber, a history of natural resource workers, their unions, and the timber industry in the Northwest. His most recent book, which he gave us a talk from a few years ago for us, is A History of America in 10 Strikes, title self-explanatory, and he's currently working on both a collection of essays on American organizers and, secondly, a history of the modern Pacific Northwest, in looking at its emergence in regional identity, incorporating labor, politics, religion, and culture. This past summer, Erik participated in a scholarly exchange program organized by the Organization of American Historians, in which he traveled to Japan to spend time with students and teachers there. What connects all of these impressive projects is that Erik is deeply interested in not just events of the past, but in how we remember them, how we memorialize them, and what that means for us today, and especially in the relationship between work, labor, and environmentalism, both of which are the subjects of today's talk. Over to you, Erik.
Well, I thank you all for being here and braving the weather. It's an environmental talk. I'm certainly not going to complain about the rain. It would seem hypocritical. Plus, that's the worst drought we've had in over a decade since I've been here, so I would say that the rain is good. But I'm going to keep this to about 15 to 20 minutes to keep it short and get everybody out of the rain. I want to thank Miriam and the History Society and everybody else for setting this up. So, for me, anyway, as a labor historian, like many of you, I'm very interested in labor history for labor history's sake, but I'm far more interested in the sense of what it can do for us today, and the way in which it can help us address contemporary problems. And I think in order to do that, we'd have to be honest about mistakes. Right? We can't tell a rosy history where we all come out looking good, because sometimes we don't. right? And I think that, you know, in recent years, there's been a lot of tension between labor and environmental movements, and that is the subject of today's talk. So it's not really Rhode Island based, it's more national based. But I think that it is quite relevant, particularly given the recent alliance between the AFL-CIO and various unions and Rhode Island environmental organizations, which is tremendously positive. And, you know, and so I think that in order to kind of set this up a bit, we need to take a big step back and I think understand what are sort of core issues that unite humans generally, regardless of society, right? And obviously some may come to mind: family, religion, right? Most societies have some form of this. Work is absolutely some of this as well, right? All societies, basically through human history, have had some form of work culture that develops, right? Sometimes under capitalism, sometimes under socialism, but there's a long history before that. And I think equal to that is that every culture has some interactions with the natural world around them, right? Human societies are based upon trying to make a living, a go of it, by taking natural resources and turning it into products that humans can use, whether we're talking about the development of corn in Mexico thousands of years ago, or we're talking about, you know, a steel mill today. These things all tie us together, but we don't often think of the natural world as being central to the American labor movement and to the experience of workers. And I want to push back on that a little bit. And that's especially true for working class people, right? That in the history of the working class and in the history of industrialization, who are the people who are most exposed to the toxicity of industrial production? It's working people, right? You know, who is it? And that's very true through, you know, going through the 19th century, where workers at the steel plant would live next to the plant and be exposed to all kinds of toxins and smoke, not only on the job, but at home as well, which was right outside the factory gates, while the superintendent lived on the nearby hill and was unaffected by this. Or it's today, right? What are the communities in Rhode Island that are most affected by the legacy of our significant industrial heritage, right? These are communities of Black and Latino and Native people living in places like Central Falls and Pawtucket and, you know, near the Bay and Providence. And these environmental justice movements are inherently working class movements, regardless of whether, you know, organized labor is involved with them or not. Okay? And so I think that it's very important that we think about environmental issues as a working class issue. And that's especially true given the realities of climate change, right? For me, this is I'm from the West Coast. The forests that I grew up in, like, they're gone. Like, they're never coming back. And it's changing on a yearly basis. We're seeing that in Rhode Island as well, you know, with all of our sea-based issues. Who's going to suffer the most from drought? Who's going to suffer the most from heat? It's going to be the poor who do not have access to air conditioning. Right? It's going to be people in inner cities where you're going to see, because of the heat and humidity, higher rates of cockroaches, which leads to high rates of asthma among working class kids, especially children of color. And so these are all working class issues, okay? And too often, labor and environmentalists in the last 30 to 40 years have not worked together on these issues. And we need to understand how that came to be, and also to recover a lost prehistory. A lost history before the 1980s, in which there was significant growth and meaningful alliance between organized labor and the developing environmental movement in order to recover a past that can be useful for us today in exploring ways in which we can move forward on these issues. Okay, so again, the history of, you know, the great disasters of, say, the late 20th century is a history of the working class, right? The Denora smog in 1948, in which 20 people die because of the combination of steel mill pollution and a weather inversion, which helps lead to the Clean Air Act. These are United Steelworkers of America members and their families who are dying. when the Cuyahoga River catches on fire, which famously happened in 1969, but if you've ever seen the picture of it, and that actually is a picture from the 50s because it caught on fire all the time, and like they didn't even bother to send a photographer in 69. They just used the old picture because it happened all the time. Those are working communities living along the Cuyahoga River. In West Virginia in 1972, when the Buffalo Creek Dam gives way, this earthen dam that held back coal sludge and killed several dozen people, many of whom are mine workers and their families, this is a result of a corporate indifference to both nature and to the working class. So there's a really long history. If we look at these disasters, they are of an environmental nature, and were seen at the time by the growing environmental communities as a problem that needs to be solved. But moreover, and I think this is what's actually important, is that there are these long histories, right? And the labor movement is older, basically, than the environmental movement. A popular environmental movement is really mostly a post-war thing, post-World War II, right? And the labor movement's well established by then, okay? And so, the labor movement has a head start, and in its early days, the labor movement is a little less concerned with things like environmentalism, because it's looking to have its workers simply make money, right? To gain union power, to gain dignity at work. The idea of cleaning up the factories comes a little bit later, right? And that comes out of a history of unionization, actually, because as workers see their lives improve, they also begin to feel like, well, maybe I don't have to get sick on the job. Maybe I don't have to die. Maybe I don't have to be exposed to these chemicals. Maybe I can be around to see my grandchildren. And so unions begin to push on these issues as well by the 1960s and 1970s. The very first kind of incidents of this go back to the 20s, actually, when American Federation of Labor Officials were working with public power advocates in Pennsylvania to try to develop electricity for all. And this kind of is a precursor to the Tennessee Valley Authority and the big New Deal programs. I wrote a book called Empire Timber, again, that Miriam mentioned, that explores the history of basically the ways in which workers in a single industry, in this case the timber industry in the Pacific Northwest, used their unions to promote their own environmental agenda through the 20th century. And they do, going back to the IWW, but then especially in 1937, the development of a union that probably you don't know, called the International Woodworkers of America, that begins to work very closely with existing environmental groups, even President Roosevelt, who's very concerned about the state of the forest, to fight for sustainable forestry, right? The idea that we need to make sure that there were going to be jobs in our communities for perpetuity. And that if the timber companies were allowed to simply control how all the trees are cut, all the jobs will disappear by the year 2000, which is exactly what happens. Right, and so, but there is this long history, including bills at Congress, going really early, and I think it's telling. So, 1960, Congress is debating what's going to become the Wilderness Act, right, which protects all this amazing land in the West. And the president of the IWA, a guy named Al Hartung, testifies before Congress in favor of the bill, even though the bill will take timber out of production for his own members. And the reason is he tells Congress that inevitably, when the 6-hour day comes, that we will need luxury leisure time for our members. And it's telling because, of course, we don't have the 6-hour day, and we certainly don't have the 30-hour week. But it was this optimism that still existed in 1960, that things were going to keep getting better for the working class, right? And then it doesn't. Through the 70s, this union, as well as other unions such as the oil, chemical, and atomic workers, the auto workers, the steel workers to some extent, and other unions are actively working with environmentalists for their own agendas and for mutual agendas. So, for instance, the OCAW goes on strike in Maine against Shell Oil, and there becomes a national campaign led by the Sierra Club to get people who had Shell Oil gas credit cards, remember back in the days of those, to tear up their cards and send them back. And some of the environmentalist community is a little uncomfortable with this, but the leadership of the Sierra Club and other environmental community or environmental groups said, look, we need to build a powerful movement. In order to do that, we need solidarity with workers. These are worker safety and health issues that they're striking over. We have to stand up in solidarity with them. And they do. Okay? The IWA is working, like a lot of for those of you who've worked in factories, back in the 70s, like you would get chemicals that you'd be working with and like you have no idea what they even are. They're not labeled. There's no safety information on them. And so they're working with environmentalists to figure out like what is it that they're actually being exposed to here in order to, be able to try to negotiate and bargain over it, etc. So you have these like really significant histories that develop. Now you go into more detail, but I don't want to go on too long. What happens? Why do we see this break in the late 70s and early 80s, and nowhere more than my Pacific Northwest timber industry with the spotted owl and environmentalism and this belief that we're at war with each other? Well, a few things happen, right? One is that both the labor movement and environmental movement comes under attack from the rise of the modern conservative movement. I mean, that's really the most important thing. Because the rise of the modern conservative movement develops in the early 70s based as a response against the labor movement, against the environmental movement, as well as against the consumer rights movement. They were all holding corporations to account, so like GM couldn't, produce a car like the, Corvair that like if you rear-ended it would just explode, right? This is the whole Nader thing. And so corporations are being held to account, and so you have the beginnings of the modern right-wing corporate agenda developed in the early 70s, and by 1980 has kind of gained enough power to take over the Republican Party, and Reagan is elected, right? And Reagan is a huge problem here, right? He's kind of one of the many bad guys, and he's one of the worst. Because it isn't even so much with the air traffic controller strike and firing them, well, as egregious as that was, so much as it gave the impetus to private industry to say, go ahead and bust your unions, the government's going to do nothing about that. And so you see the strike in, the Phelps Dodge strike in Arizona in 1983, the Hormel strike in 1985 in Minnesota, that if you've seen American Dream, strikes here in Rhode Island, the companies are incentivized to just send their to try to bust that union contract, send their members on strike. And then, they just get rid of the union entirely, and it's often very successful, and we've seen the impact of that in, the total density of the labor movement today, which, of course, is low, especially in the public sector. Especially in the private sector. At the same time, deindustrialization and sending jobs overseas, which is a truly bipartisan agenda, started, going really back to Lyndon Johnson, certainly going through Clinton and Obama to no small extent as well, but with Reagan and Bush all involved too, sends these industrial jobs overseas. The idea that we could fix our workplaces, turn them into safe and healthy places, came out of the idea that the jobs would be there, right? The belief that the jobs were there, that companies would work with unions more or less, and that stability had reached the working class. But you start sending those jobs overseas, people start getting scared, and the employers begin to openly lie to the workers, right? They lie to the unions and say, oh, if this new rule is passed that's going to make it so that if you're making car seats you don't get cancer, we're going to move the jobs to Mexico. Now, they're either moving the jobs to Mexico anyway, or they're just lying about it. We know this from documents. But it gives them a place to take advantage of this opportunity and begin to cleave away this growing environmental labor alliance. For environmentalists, what Reagan does is that he makes it, the government had passed all these new laws, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, environmental creation of the EPA, all this stuff. But under Reagan, it didn't want to follow its own laws. And so it starts just not following the law. So environmentalism had really come out of a popular movement, right? People became interested in environmentalism, including workers, because they could taste the pollution. They could see it. They could smell it. It's a visceral thing in their bodies that they know is making them sick, right? And so, that gets solved, right? That's a huge success. Some of it's because those jobs go overseas, but we don't usually physically feel and taste death by pollution anymore. Okay? It's less common than it used to be. And so, environmentalists need to figure out a way to like fund lawsuits to force the government to do what they're going to do. What's going to get rich people to give money for lawsuits? Pictures of polar bears, right? And other charismatic animals. The working class side of it begins to fall away as the environmentalism moves toward becoming a movement reliant on big finance. And as we go forward today, like you see that develop over the next 20, 25 years, you know, to where, you know, you have the rise of a radical grassroots environmentalism that can be very anti-worker that happened in the 1990s with organizations such as Earth First. You have, you know, a kind of total indifference to working class people, right? And I think that, you know, there mistakes have been made by both sides in this. You know, from the union perspective, I think that to a certain extent, there's been the cultural shifts that the rise of the new conservative movement and its handmade neoliberalism bring has created sometimes a real cultural identification with employers. So the environmentalists are a bunch of hippies, right? And you have these kind of cultural issues that get in the way of solidarity. We let cultural issues get in the way of class consciousness, whether that's race, gender, sexuality, sexual orientation, environmentalism. These things have gotten in the way of building a broader working class movement in America, and union movements are certainly partially responsible for that. But from the perspective of environmentalists, they became so dependent on big money that they became addicted to green capitalism. And the problem with green capitalism is that a capitalist may believe that we need to save the earth, and he wants to make money off that, but he doesn't believe it's worth saving the earth if he has to have a union to do it, right? So that this green capitalism has been as anti-union as any other capitalism, and this has been a major problem, right? And I think that you know, when we've seen this in recent years, everything from the battles over pipelines, including here in Rhode Island with the thing in Burrillville, where you've seen really negative and very unfortunate and I think unnecessary hostility between social movements, as well as in places like North Dakota and Nebraska, where, frankly, a lot of young people who are socially conscious don't necessarily believe the labor movement's an ally. Like, they're interested, they want to unionize, but they don't necessarily see pre-existing labor as an ally, in part because of these very public battles over environmentalism that they believe in because the planet is dying. Okay, so it's kind of a big deal to save the planet, and so you have to understand where these people are coming from. But at the same time, you see a kind of a loss of the meaning of the word solidarity around everywhere. That I think that we live in this neoliberal world, and this neoliberalism is an individualistic ideology, right? That the idea of solidarity has shifted to you should do what I want you to do when I want you to do it. That you need to show solidarity to me, but I don't necessarily need to show solidarity to you if it's not my issue. I have to call this when I teach these classes like politics as like your sleeve tattoo. Right, like, here are my issues, and if you're a politician or you're a member of another movement and you don't fit all of my issues, well, hell with you. And that's not a way to build any kind of progressive politics. Okay, so I think there's a lot of like very structural issues here, some of which the labor movement has responsibility for, some of which environmentalists have responsibility for, and some of which are just part of our culture today. But I do think, and I'll kind of close with this to say that I think it's what's happening in Rhode Island right now, having the hard conversations, right? What does just transition mean? It's not the same thing in an environmental justice community in Pawtucket and the laborers union. Those are different. They may have different meanings. How do we build solidarity? It goes back to the most simple thing possible. It's organizing, right? Like, you have to actually have conversations with people and talk to people and work out these problems and build movements going forward. And somehow, almost all of these social movements had lost that in the 80s and into the 90s and into the 2000s. That we had lost that. Kind of starts coming back. The Trans-Pacific Partnership under Obama and the way that labor and environmentalists came together to work on that was really important and really helped rebuild some of those bridges. And now it's happening at these state levels. And Rhode Island is certainly among the best, but it's happening in other states too. For these plans to rebuild a green infrastructure that has union jobs, right? That's the key, is there are union jobs, that the steel hopefully is at least somewhat made in the United States, that it's put up and maintained by union workers, that we rebuild the schools and we rebuild the public transportation system and all of this other stuff that's going to create a more sustainable Rhode Island that has a chance of being around and in a functional state in a century, so that our grandkids and great-grandkids can also enjoy a quality of life in Rhode Island and have that quality of life help working-class people, is the key to moving forward. Because the reality is that in this society right now in 2022, neither the environmental movement nor the labor movement is strong enough to create national legislation on its own. It's not 1938 for the labor movement, and it's not 1970 for environmentalists anymore. And you have to come together if you want to win. And so going back to these principles of solidarity, and what that really means, and how to organize within different movements, that's something that we can grab onto from this history. And I hope that, as minimal as it was, that very brief overview of this past history, which is much more complex and real and big than most people realize, can help us to come forward and to move these conversations in positive directions. Now it's really starting to rain, so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric. And now for an abbreviated musical program to end. And while Mary Lee is setting up, one thing you've all learned today is that when the Labor History Society puts rain or shine on a flyer, we mean rain or shine. That was written 3 weeks ago in the midst of a drought, and I didn't believe in jinxes until today. So, Mary Lee, close us out.
Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union makes us strong. Is there aught we hold in common with the greedy parasite, who would lash us into serfdom, who would crush us with his might? Is there anything left to us but to organize and fight? The union makes us strong. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever, for the union makes us strong. All the world that's owned by idle drones is ours and ours alone. We have laid the wide foundations, built it skyward stone by stone. It is ours not to slave men, but to cherish for our own. The union makes us strong. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union makes us strong. In our hands is placed a power greater than their hoarded gold, greater than the might of armies magnified 1,000-fold, can bring to birth this new world from the ashes of the old. The union makes us strong. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union Solidarity forever, for the union makes us strong.
Thank you all and happy Labor Day.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Labor Vision. We appreciate your input and encourage your comments.